They thought it was just another kid begging for change. $1. That's all he asked for. One single dollar. Most people wouldn't have thought twice. They would have tossed him a crumpled bill, if they even acknowledged him at all. But this wasn't most people. This was Sylvester Stallone. And instead of loose change, he gave the boy something that would change his life forever. Sound crazy, right? You're about to hear one of the most unexpected, mind-blowing stories of fate, grit, and second chances. And by the time you finish, you'll never look at a simple act of kindness the same way again. If you love real, powerful stories that stick with you long after they're told, hit that subscribe button and follow Storygram. We drop life-changing stories every day. Ones that make you think, make you feel, and maybe even make you see the world a little differently. Now let's begin. Sylvester Stallone wasn't in the mood for interruptions. It had been a long day, the kind that left a man tired in a way no amount of sleep could fix. His body could handle exhaustion. He had trained through pain, pushed past limits most men wouldn't dare to test. But some days, the weight of the world felt heavier than even he could carry. That's why he was walking alone that evening, hands in his pockets, his hoodie pulled up to keep out the cold. No security, no entourage, just a man trying to clear his head. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw him. A kid. Thin, small for his age, maybe 10 or 11. His clothes weren't just old. They were barely holding together. Shoes too big, a jacket too thin for the biting air. But it wasn't his size or his clothes that caught Stallone's attention. It was his eyes. They were sharp, focused, like he had already seen too much of the world and knew better than to expect kindness from it. The boy hesitated, like he was about to walk past, but then he made a decision. He stepped closer. "Hey, mister." His voice was steady, no fear in it. "Got $1?" Stallone stopped. $1. Not a speech, not a story, just the ask, clean and simple. He had heard it before, 1,000 times, probably more. In every city, in every country, people asked for money. Some begged, some tried to sell a sob story, and others got aggressive. But this kid? He just asked. No lies, no theatrics. Stallone didn't move, just studied him. Why? The kid blinked, caught off guard. Most people either gave him the money or ignored him. Almost no one asked why. "I'm hungry," he answered after a moment. "And I don't have anything to eat." No act, no embellishment, just the truth. Stallone reached into his pocket. The kid's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and wariness, like he wasn't sure if money was coming out or a lecture. But Stallone didn't pull out $1. He didn't pull out anything. Instead, he asked, "You ever heard of Rocky?" The kid's brows furrowed. "Yeah, the movie?" Stallone nodded. "You like it?" The boy shrugged. "It's all right." Stallone smirked. That answer, casual, unimpressed, told him more about the kid than anything else could have. "What's your name?" The kid hesitated, then said Eddie. "Eddie," Stallone repeated, letting the name settle. "All right, Eddie. I'll make you a deal. You want $1, right?" Eddie nodded. "I'll give you 10, Stallone said. "But you have to do something for me first." Eddie's eyes narrowed. He had learned, the hard way, that nothing ever came free. "What is it?" Stallone pointed to the sidewalk. "Drop down. Give me 10 push-ups." Eddie frowned. "For $10? Stallone shrugged. "That's the deal. You want it, you earn it." Eddie hesitated. But then, without another word, he dropped down and started pushing. 1.2.3. The form wasn't perfect, but the effort was real. Stallone watched, arms crossed, nodding slightly. By the time Eddie hit 10, his arms were shaking, but he pushed through. When he got up, he wiped his hands on his too big jacket, breathing hard. Stallone grinned. "Not bad." Eddie wiped his nose, waiting for his money. Instead, Stallone asked, "You ever boxed before?" Eddie gave him a look. "Do I look like I box?" Stallone chuckled. "Not yet." Eddie didn't know it, but this moment, this cold night on a random sidewalk, was about to change everything. Because Stallone wasn't just going to give him $10. He was about to give him something worth more than money. Eddie held out his hand, expecting the $10. Stallone didn't move. "Tell me something, Eddie," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Have you ever quit something before?" Eddie frowned. "What?" "Quit. Stallone repeated. Have you ever started something and then given up when it got too hard? Eddie shifted on his feet. I don't know, maybe. Stallone nodded, like he expected that answer. What if I told you that how you do one thing is how you do everything? Eddie blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Stallone said, if you quit on small things, you quit on big things. If you take the easy way out once, you'll do it again. And one day, you'll wake up wondering why nothing in your life ever changed. Eddie looked at him, confused but intrigued. He had asked for $1, not a life lesson. Stallone finally reached into his pocket. He pulled out a $10 bill and held it between his fingers. Eddie reached for it, but Stallone pulled it back just an inch. You earned this, Stallone said. But I got a question for you. Do you want this $10? Or do you want to learn how to earn 100? Eddie hesitated. This was getting weird. What's the catch? Stallone smiled. No catch. Just a choice. He waved the 10. Take this, walk away, and you got a meal for the night. Then he pointed at himself. Or stick with me for one day, and I'll show you how to fight for something bigger. Eddie hesitated. His stomach growled. A meal sounded pretty damn good. But he looked at Stallone, really looked at him. He knew who this guy was now. And something about the way he talked, the way he stood, made Eddie feel like this wasn't some random dude wasting his time. It felt like a test. What would we do? Eddie asked. Stallone's grin widened. First, he said, tossing the 10 back into his pocket, we get you something to eat. Eddie exhaled, relieved. Maybe this guy wasn't messing with him after all. Come on, Stallone said, jerking his head toward a diner across the street. You like burgers? Eddie nodded. Good, Stallone said. Because you're going to need the energy. Eddie furrowed his brow. For what? Stallone smirked. You'll see. They walked inside, the warmth of the diner hitting them immediately. It smelled like coffee and fresh fries. A waitress glanced up, then did a double take when she recognized Stallone. Holy crap, she breathed. Stallone just smiled. Hey, sweetheart, can we get 2 burgers? Extra fries for my friend here. Eddie slid into the booth, feeling out of place. He'd never been anywhere this nice. As they waited for their food, Stallone leaned back. So, Eddie, tell me something. What do you want to be when you grow up? Eddie shrugged. Never really thought about it. Stallone raised an eyebrow. Never? Eddie picked at the table. Ain't got time for that. Just trying to get through the day. Stallone nodded, like he understood. And maybe he did. You got parents? Eddie tensed. Nah, no family? Eddie shook his head. Just me. Stallone studied him for a second. That's tough, he said finally. Eddie shrugged like it didn't matter. But Stallone could tell it did. Their food arrived. Eddie dug in like he hadn't eaten in days. Maybe he hadn't. Stallone let him eat, watching him carefully. Finally, when Eddie had slowed down, Stallone spoke. Have you ever heard about my life before Rocky? Eddie shook his head, mouth full. Stallone chuckled. Yeah, most people don't. They just see the movies. They don't know what it took to get there. Eddie swallowed his bite. Like what? Stallone leaned forward. I was broke, Eddie. Not just a little money problem broke. Sleeping in a bus station broke. Had to sell my dog just to buy food. Eddie blinked. For real? Stallone nodded. For real. Eddie frowned. What happened to the dog? Stallone smirked. I got him back. Eddie didn't know why, but that part made him feel better. But here's the thing, Stallone continued. Nobody gave me a handout. Nobody saved me. I had to fight my way out. Eddie looked at him, interested now. You said you don't know what you want to be when you grow up, Stallone said. But I'm telling you right now, you could be whatever the hell you want. Eddie snorted. Yeah, okay. I'm serious. Stallone leaned in. But first, you have to learn how to take a punch. Eddie hesitated. A punch? Stallone grinned. Finish your fries, kid. We're going to find out if you have what it takes. Eddie didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. Eddie wiped his mouth with his sleeve as he finished the last of his fries. Stallone watched him waiting. You ready? He asked. Eddie nodded, though he wasn't sure for what. Stallone tossed a few bills on the table and stood up. Let's go. They stepped outside, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Eddie figured they were heading somewhere fancy. Maybe a gym with punching bags and a boxing ring like in the movies. Nope, Stallone walked him right into a dirty alleyway behind the diner. Eddie frowned. Oh, what are we doing? Stallone grinned. We're training. Eddie looked around. Trash cans. A couple of rats darting under a dumpster. Broken glass in the corner. Training for what? Eddie asked, crossing his arms. Stallone took off his jacket, set it down, and raised his fists. For life, he said. Eddie's eyes widened. Whoa, hold up, man. I'm not about to fight you. Stallone chuckled. Relax, kid. I'm not going to hit you. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Then what? Stallone took a step forward. Hit me. Eddie froze. What? You heard me, Stallone said, tapping his own chin. Hit me. Eddie scoffed. Man, I'm not hitting you. Stallone's face was calm. Why not? Eddie frowned. 'Cause you're you. Stallone nodded. That's right. And that's your problem. Eddie tilted his head. What? Stallone lowered his hands. You think I'm something special. You think guys like me are untouchable. Eddie hesitated. Stallone leaned in slightly. But what if I told you I was just a guy who got back up every time life knocked me down? Eddie stayed quiet. Stallone nodded. Hit me, Eddie. Eddie swallowed. His fists clenched at his sides. Nah, man, he mumbled. I don't want to fight. Stallone's face didn't change. That's funny, he said, because life's been fighting you since the day you were born. Eddie flinched. Stallone saw it. Nobody taught you how to fight back, did they? Eddie clenched his jaw. Your parents left, Stallone continued. You grew up alone. You got used to people ignoring you, pushing you aside, treating you like you don't matter. Eddie's breathing got heavier. Stallone took a step closer. They hit you, Eddie said. Not with fists, but with life. Every damn day. Eddie looked away. Stallone wasn't done. And you never hit back. Silence. Eddie's hands were shaking now. Stallone took a slow breath. You don't fight because nobody ever told you that you could. Eddie's lips pressed into a thin line. Stallone held his ground. Hit me, Eddie. Eddie shook his head. Hit me, Stallone repeated. Eddie took a deep breath. His hands tightened into fists. And then he swung. It wasn't much. A wild, sloppy punch. But landed right on Stallone's chest. Stallone barely moved. But Eddie? Eddie took a step back, shocked by his own action. Stallone smiled. Not bad, he said. Eddie's chest rose and fell. Something inside him had cracked open. Stallone saw it, and he knew this was just the beginning. Eddie stood frozen, his knuckles still tingling from a punch. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Stallone didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He just looked at Eddie, nodding slowly. That, Stallone said, his voice calm but firm, was the first time in your life you ever fought back. Eddie swallowed hard. His breathing was uneven, his fists still clenched. Stallone placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. You feel that? Eddie nodded. He didn't have the words for it, but he felt it. A strange rush through his veins, a warmth in his chest. Power. Stallone took a step back and raised his hands again. Now do it again. Eddie blinked. Wait, what? Stallone smiled. You heard me, kid. Again. Eddie hesitated. Don't think, Stallone said. Just do. Eddie's muscles tensed, and then he threw another punch. This one was stronger. Faster. Stallone caught it with his palm. Better, he said, but you're still hesitating. Eddie frowned. What do you mean? Stallone let go of his fist. You're still afraid. Eddie exhaled sharply. Of course, I'm afraid. You're Sylvester Stallone. What if I? Stallone held up a hand, stopping him. This isn't about me, Eddie. This is about you. Eddie looked away. You've been pulling your punches your whole life, kid. Afraid of messing up. Afraid of looking stupid. Afraid people will hit you back harder. Eddie's jaw tightened. Stallone stepped closer. But you want to know the truth? Eddie slowly looked back at him. The worst thing you can do in life is pull your punches. Silence. Stallone let those words settle in the air. Eddie swallowed. You don't have to be the strongest guy in the world, Stallone said. But if you don't throw a real punch when it matters, you'll regret it. Eddie's fingers curled into fists again. Are you ready? Stallone asked. Eddie gave a small nod. Stallone smirked. Good. And then he moved, not to hit Eddie, but to make him react. A quick step forward, a shift of his weight, a flicker of movement. Eddie flinched. Stallone shook his head. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Eddie took a breath. Again. This time, Eddie swung faster. Stallone dodged easily, but he smiled. Better. Eddie exhaled. Stallone studied him. You know what happens when you stop hesitating? Eddie shook his head. You get to see what you're really capable of. Something in Eddie's chest tightened. Now, Stallone said, rolling his shoulders, let's see if you can hit me for real. Eddie's eyes widened. He barely had time to react before Stallone moved again. Quick, smooth, controlled. Not to hit him, but to test him. Eddie ducked. His instincts kicked in. He threw a punch. Stallone sidestepped, but this time, it was close. Eddie stumbled slightly, but his face lit up. Stallone grinned. See? You're already learning. Eddie panted, nodding. His chest was on fire, but it wasn't exhaustion. It was something else. Adrenaline. Confidence. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. For the first time, he felt like he could actually win. Stallone clapped him on the back. You got fight in you, kid. Eddie grinned. Yeah? Stallone smirked. Yeah. Now let's see what else you got. And just like that, they kept going. For the next hour, Stallone drilled him. Simple movements. Dodging. Throwing a proper punch. Keeping his feet steady. Eddie had never trained before, but he picked it up fast. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. But he had heart. And Stallone saw it. After a while, Stallone finally held up a hand. All right, enough. Eddie wiped sweat off his forehead, panting. Stallone smirked. Not bad, kid. Eddie straightened up, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Pride. Stallone grabbed his jacket. Come on, we're not done yet. Eddie raised an eyebrow. Where are we going? Stallone threw an arm around his shoulder. Somewhere important. Eddie didn't know what that meant, but he knew one thing. His life was already changing. Eddie sat in the passenger seat of Stallone's car, his legs still buzzing from the workout. His knuckles were raw, his arms heavy, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had never felt this alive. The car rolled through the streets of Los Angeles, past glowing billboards, endless traffic, and the kind of dreams that hung in the air like smog. Eddie stared out the window, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had thrown punches at Sylvester Stallone, and Stallone had thrown something even bigger back at him. A chance. You hungry, kid? Stallone asked, breaking the silence. Eddie blinked, turning to him. Yeah. Yeah. Stallone chuckled. Good. You ever been to Mario's? Eddie shook his head. You're in for a treat. 15 minutes later, they pulled up in front of a small Italian restaurant. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious. Just a little hole-in-the-wall place with faded red booze and the kind of smell that made your stomach growl on instinct. As soon as they stepped inside, the owner, a short, heavy-set man with a thick mustache, lit up. Hey, Sly, you finally show up again. Huh? Stallone grinned. What can I say, Mario? I missed your terrible service. Mario laughed, slapping him on the back. Yeah. You sit. I bring food. No menu. You eat what I make. Stallone led Eddie to a booth near the back. The place was warm, the kind of warm that made you feel like you belonged. Eddie sat down across from Stallone, still unsure if this was real. So, Eddie, Stallone said, leaning back, tell me something. Eddie hesitated. What? What do you want? Eddie frowned. Like, for dinner? Stallone smirked. No, kid. In life. Eddie froze, because no one had ever asked him that before. Not his teachers. Not the guys on the street. Not even he himself. He shifted in his seat. I don't know. Stallone studied him. Yeah, you do. Eddie looked down at the table, tracing the edge of the napkin with his finger. Did he? He had spent so long surviving, just trying to make it through the day, that he had never stopped to think about what came next. I guess he swallowed. I guess I don't want to be a loser. Stallone leaned in. Then don't be. Eddie let out a breath. It's not that simple. Stallone tilted his head. Isn't it? Eddie hesitated. Then Stallone tapped the table. Listen, kid. I grew up in a crummy part of Philly. No money. No connections. I had to fight for every damn thing I ever got. Eddie nodded. He knew the story. Everyone did. Stallone continued. You know what the difference is between people who make it and people who don't? Eddie shook his head. They get up. Eddie frowned. What do you mean? Stallone smiled. Everybody gets knocked down. Life hits you. People hit you. But the ones who make it, they get up. Every time. Eddie swallowed hard. Tell me something, Stallone said. Have you ever lost a fight? Eddie let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, plenty. And did you get up? Eddie paused. Sometimes. Stallone nodded. That's where it starts. Eddie exhaled. And then what? Stallone leaned back, arms crossed. Then you stop letting people tell you who you are. Eddie looked away. Stallone's voice softened. I see it, kid. You've been told your whole life you aren't worth much. Eddie's jaw tightened. But you know what? Those people don't matter. Eddie looked up, his throat tight. Then who does? Stallone pointed at him. You. Eddie felt something crack inside him. Something raw. Something real. Mario appeared at the table, dropping 2 steaming plates of pasta in front of him. Eat, before I charge you double. Stallone grinned. Yeah. Eddie barely noticed the food. His mind was still spinning. Because, for the first time in his life, someone was looking at him like he was more than just another kid from the streets. More than just a kid who didn't belong. And that was worth more than $1. Eddie twirled the spaghetti onto his fork, but his mind was somewhere else. Across the table, Stallone ate like a man who had worked hard enough to earn every bite. There was no rush, no tension, just quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly who you are. Eddie wanted that. He wanted to know who he was beyond the fights, beyond the struggles, beyond the streets. So, Stallone said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, what's next? Eddie hesitated. Next? Yes, Stallone leaned in. You don't strike me as the type of kid who just asks for $1 and calls it a day. Eddie exhaled. I don't know, man. I never thought this far ahead. Stallone nodded like he understood. Well, now's the time. Eddie pushed his plate away slightly, gathering his thoughts. I used to think I was just going to end up like the other guys I know. You know, barely making it. Hustling, getting into trouble. He rubbed his hands together. But now, after today, I don't know. Maybe there's something else. Stallone smirked. There is. Eddie looked up. How do you know? Because I see it, kid. You have a fight in you. And not just in the ring. Stallone leaned back. You know how many people I've met who had talent? A lot. But do you know how many had heart? He held up 2 fingers. Not many. Eddie was quiet. Stallone studied him. You got heart, Eddie. And that'll take you further than you can imagine. Eddie took a deep breath. So what do I do? Stallone grinned. You work. You sweat. You show up even when you don't feel like it. And when life knocks you on your ass, you get up. He tapped the table. That's it. Eddie frowned. That's it? That's everything. Eddie let the words sink in. It sounded so simple, so basic. But deep down, he knew Stallone was right. I don't have anything, though, Eddie admitted. No money. No plan. Just this. He held up his fists. Stallone smirked. That's more than most. Eddie nodded slowly. So what? I just start punching my way through life? Stallone chuckled. No, kid. You fight for something. Eddie swallowed. Like what? Stallone shrugged. That's for you to figure out. Eddie exhaled through his nose. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had never had someone talk to him like this before. Like he was worth something. Like he mattered. Stallone glanced at his watch. All right, kid. I have to roll. He slid out of the booth and dropped some cash on the table. Eddie stood too, feeling an unexpected pang of disappointment. That's it. Stallone grinned. That's it. They walked outside. The air was cooler now, the streetlights buzzing overhead. Eddie shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly unsure of what to say. Stallone clapped him on the shoulder. You got my number, right? Eddie nodded. Good. Stallone's voice softened. Call me when you figure out what you're fighting for. Eddie hesitated. And if I don't? Stallone smirked. Then I guess you just asked me for $1. Eddie's throat tightened. He shook Stallone's hand. Thanks. Stallone held his gaze. Don't thank me yet, kid. Go earn it. With that, he turned and walked toward his car, slipping into the driver's seat. Eddie watched him drive off, the red taillights disappearing into the city. For the first time in his life, he felt something new. Hope. Not because someone had given him money, not because someone had done something for him, but because someone had believed in him. And maybe, just maybe, he could believe in himself too.